Welcome to the gut health video. So if you're here, then you probably noticed on your questionnaire or in my feedback message that gut health is a most likely root cause for your symptoms of histamine intolerance. So what we'll be covering in this video is a quick overview of the links between histamine intolerance and gut health, and then we'll have a closer look at dysbiosis, inflammation, and common food intolerances that could be linked with your symptoms. And for each of those, I'll be giving you some tips of tests you can do and changes you can make to your diet and lifestyle to help you address those root causes. At the end, we'll take a bit of a closer look at testing, and then I'll give you an overview of the tasks I recommend you complete this week. For this video, there is a handout on your Practice Better account called Gut Health. So I recommend that after you've watched this, you download that handout and just maybe print it out or have it on your phone so you can look at it, which just summarizes the things that we talk about in today's video. So as you know by now, the histamine in your digestive tract, so histamine from food, is broken down by the enzyme called diamine oxidase. And this enzyme is produced by mucus cells which line the gut. So the healthier the cells around your gut are, the better you'll be able to produce DAO. To produce DAO, these cells require vitamin C, vitamin B6, and copper, which is why sometimes these nutrients can be helpful for people with histamine intolerance. But we'll talk more about supplements and nutrients in particular next week during the final video. So many stomach conditions and gut health conditions can impair your DAO production. So if something is going wrong in your gut, you might be producing less DAO because those cells are not functioning optimally. Another thing that can happen is that depending on the bacteria in your gut, these bacteria might be leading to elevated levels of histamine. And finally, inflammation and tissue damage, which can be as a result of intolerances, of infections, of the microbiota in your gut. All these kinds of things trigger histamine release. And high levels of histamine cause more tissue damage. So when there are problems in our gut, we can get into this vicious cycle where there's something that's out of balance, and that's causing inflammation, which means histamine is released. Then that histamine is causing more damage, so there's more inflammation, so more histamine is released. And the more that happens, the less we can produce DAO, so the less histamine we can break down, so the levels increase even more. So when we're addressing gut health, we really need to be breaking out of this vicious cycle. One reason this can happen, that we get into this vicious cycle, is something called dysbiosis. And dysbiosis basically means that there is an imbalance in the microbiota in your gut. So ideally, your gut should be this beautiful garden with lots of different types of flowers and vegetables and fruit trees, everything really in balance, helpful insects flying around, pollinating your flowers, all this kind of stuff. But sometimes what can happen is we can have this real overgrowth of weeds, or we've got the wrong type of insects in there, or maybe it's really barren, maybe there's no plants growing. So when there's imbalance like that in your gut, that can lead to elevated levels of histamine. There are certain bacteria which increase your histamine levels because they produce histamine. They're listed here, and next week, when we're talking about supplements, I'll give you a list of probiotics that I think are helpful because they don't include these species that might be increasing your histamine levels. Many people take these really high dose probiotics that are touted for their gut health promoting properties, particularly things like Lactobacillus rhamnosus. This is really often found in probiotics, and actually it's not that helpful for people with histamine intolerance. So you don't need to memorize these. Next week we'll talk about them in a bit more detail, and you'll get a handout on them as well. But it's just maybe good to know that not all probiotics are good for all people with histamine intolerance, and that having some of these in your gut overgrowing might be contributing to your histamine intolerance. There are also pathogenic bacteria. So these ones up here are maybe neutral or could even be helpful, but then there are bacteria which are not helpful for sure, and these also increase histamine levels because they activate your immune system. So an infection with Campylobacter, C. diff, Salmonella, or Citrobacter All four of those might be causing histamine intolerance symptoms, and these are actually pathogens that your GP can test for. Although the tests are not always very accurate, so sometimes it might take your GP testing 3 or 4 times before it actually comes up. Now, the other thing that can happen when we have an imbalance in our gut in terms of the bacteria is that this can lead to damage in the gut lining, because we need certain species in certain amounts to keep our gut lining healthy. And when we don't have those, then we get damage in the gut lining, and the more damaged the gut lining, the less able we are to produce DAO. And again, we're less able to process histamine levels rise, inflammation happens, there's more damage to the gut lining, and so on. Now, just to kind of give you a bit of an overview of the studies, so there is studies that find that people with histamine intolerance tend to have decreased bacterial diversity. So that's that barren garden. They tend to have not as many species as people without histamine intolerance, not as many different types of bacteria. And we generally use that as a measure of dysbiosis and poor gut health. So the less diversity, the more dysbiosis and the poorer the gut health. Another study found that there are higher levels of histamine producing bacteria in asthma patients. And this is just one study, but there's actually numerous studies linking conditions that are generally associated with histamine and histamine symptoms with higher levels of histamine producing bacteria. And lastly, we know that bacterial overgrowth causes damage to the gut lining. So certain types of bacteria becoming too much or others not being enough will cause that damage to the gut lining, and then you won't be able to produce enough DAO anymore. So that's a quick overview of how things going wrong in your gut might be leading to your histamine symptoms, which might be rashes and eczema. So it can seem so unconnected, but actually it's really connected. And now, what do you do about that? So first of all, it's really important to be sure here. You don't want to be guessing, poking around in the dark. So you need to order a comprehensive stool test. This is not a test that your GP will do. So it's a private test, and it's much more accurate and much more detailed than a GP test would be. So I mentioned earlier, GPs might have to test 3 or 4 times to notice those pathogenic bacteria. And that's because their tests use the sample and try to grow things on it and then look at it under a microscope to identify bacteria. Whereas a comprehensive stool test takes the sample and then runs it through a DNA scanner to see which bacteria's DNA is in this stool sample. So that's much more accurate because we're not depending on things growing, we're not depending on somebody looking. It's really much more comprehensive. And that can also give you the causes of dysbiosis. So why are certain bacteria overgrowing or not growing enough in your stomach? Could there be another root cause behind the root cause? So that might be things like low stomach acid, problems with your bile and gallbladder, problems with your digestive enzymes. So this is really the first step, because then you also know which bacteria are too much, what's too little. So when you're supplementing or trying to address overgrowth, you're being really specific. You're not just coming in with an antibiotic, killing everything, creating that barren garden we've spoken about. If that test comes up with pathogenic bacteria and yeast, it's worth working one-to-one with a practitioner, because you don't want to just create a barren garden. So to be able to get rid of something pathogenic, we need to build up the good stuff. So that's 3 to 6 months work of building up the good stuff and then removing the bad stuff in a safe way so that you don't experience an exacerbation of your symptoms. So if this comes up for you on the stool test, I would recommend finding a practitioner to work one-to-one with. And if other root causes come up, like low stomach acid, problems with your bile, problems with your digestive enzymes, that's also worth working with a practitioner. Then, these are the things you can start today. So you want to reduce dysbiosis promoting foods. We know that there are certain foods that we eat that promote dysbiosis in our gut because they take away food from the good bacteria and they feed the not so helpful bacteria far too much. And they also change the environment in our gut, just making it a very uncomfortable place for the bacteria to grow. Dysbiosis promoting foods include sugar, refined carbohydrates, so that's your white flour, white rice, white pasta, those kinds of things. Alcohol, seed oils, things like margarine and sunflower oil, additives, and processed meats. You'll notice a lot of these are excluded already anyway if you're reducing histamine. So alcohol, many seed oils, additives, processed meats, those are things you're not really eating when you're trying to follow a low histamine diet. So that's already really helpful. And then you just want to be mindful of the sugar and refined carbohydrates. So all the meal plans and all the recipes that I give you during this course are really focusing on including complex carbohydrates, not refined carbohydrates, and using alternatives to sugar. So hopefully by following these meal plans and these recipes, you're also already excluding a lot of these foods without having to put in a lot of extra effort. But like a garden, if you imagine a really barren garden or a garden overgrown by weeds, it doesn't just, within a week become a perfect, beautiful, blooming garden. So you need to give your gut some time to readjust and to respond to what you're doing. The other thing you can do is increase diversity promoting foods. So these are foods that promote the good bacteria and that promote a wide range of species to grow in your gut, that create a beautiful environment for these species to flourish. Now, things like that include a rainbow of fruits and vegetables. You'll notice that's included in the meal plan. Whole grains, again, included. Nuts and seeds that are tolerated. So again, those are included. But you want to be particularly focusing on chia seeds and linseeds when you're choosing to have snacks or meals, breakfast especially, I guess. And tolerated is an important word here because we don't want to be causing inflammation. So you need to be aware of which ones you do best with. Oily fish, this you'll be having from frozen, and you'd probably be mostly having wild salmon or trout because some of the other oily fish species are high in histamine. And you want to be implementing a time restricted eating window. So, one thing that's really important for your gut to be able to be healthy and for your bacteria to be able to thrive in a good way, rather than bacteria to thrive that might be causing problems, is to give your gut a break from food. Because every time we eat, we're adding histamine, we're adding inflammation, we're adding pressure. And that over time can really run us down, particularly if we're eating all the time. So you want to be eating ideally between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. You might need to adjust this slightly because of your work schedule, your family schedule, things like that. But why 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. is because that's in line with our natural circadian rhythm. So that's naturally in line with this daytime, nighttime pattern that our body and our microbes have evolved in. So the bacteria in our gut actually take a break at night. The good ones do anyway. And so when we're throwing food in at night, that's being digested by bacteria that we don't actually want to be there, or it's overwhelming our good bacteria. It's making them ill, it's making them thrive less well. So this can be a really simple change to make. So really just say, I'm going to eat during daylight hours. Well, not daylight hours if you're living in Scandinavia and it's light from 4 a.m. to 11 p.m. But this kind of traditional thought of daylight hours that you would have at the equator, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then have a break overnight to really give your gut a time to regenerate, to clean itself, to heal itself, all those kinds of things. And then one last thing that's really important is actually managing stress. So there's a lot of research to show that stress causes dysbiosis in the gut. And if you don't address stress, your diet could be perfect. Your gut will still not be perfect. So if you know that you're a bit of a stress head, or that you're going through a stressful time, or if you just think maybe stress plays a role for me, then I would suggest you watch the stress video as well. Now, the other thing that can be going on in your gut that might be related to dysbiosis, but it might also not be, is inflammation. And many stomach or gut conditions like Crohn's, IBS, IBD increase gut inflammation. And many people with histamine intolerance have a comorbid gut condition. So, elevated levels of inflammation increase histamine production, like I'd mentioned, and that then damages the cells in your gut, and that then means you produce less DAO, and that then means that there's been higher levels of histamine, which means there's more inflammation, which means there's more damage. And actually, some researchers have suggested that DAO levels can be a marker of gut integrity. So gut integrity means how healthy is your gut lining, how inflamed is it, how much does it let through that shouldn't be getting through. And because DAO production is so affected by how healthy your gut lining is, low levels might be an indicator that there's something wrong with your gut lining. and that can be an indication of inflammation. And I've already mentioned this vicious cycle a few times. So what to do if you suspect that there's inflammation? Again, you want to be ordering a comprehensive stool test, because aside from measuring what bacteria, yeast, pathogens might be in your gut, it also measures a lot of markers of inflammation. And these markers can give us a clue as to what's causing the inflammation. So certain markers might be an indication of IBD or Crohn's disease. Others might be an indication that actually there's an infection going on here that's causing inflammation. And that's really helpful for decision making in terms of treatment. You can also request a vitamin D test from your GP and then consider supplementing if it's low. Vitamin D is really linked with inflammation, particularly gut inflammation, so that's quite a simple thing you can do. And nowadays, most GPs will be willing to test for vitamin D. And then you want to reduce what I call non-purposeful inflammation. So generally, inflammation is not a bad thing. It's developed to keep us safe from infection, from illnesses, from viruses, all these kinds of things. But certain things cause inflammation that's unnecessary. It's not helping us, it's not keeping us safe. So those things include sugar and refined carbohydrates, alcohol and caffeine, additives and preservatives, seed oils, processed meats, dairy, stress, and poor sleep. So you can see a pattern emerging here. Actually, whether it's dysbiosis or inflammation or cutting down histamine, we're doing the same things. So you're already on a really good path. You might want to just go through this and think, okay, are there any of these that are particularly an issue for me? Do I eat dairy 3 times a day, every day? Do I have a sugar habit? Is my sleep terrible? And then focus on addressing those. And then the last one, exposure to toxins and chemicals. So there you might be wanting to just evaluate your personal care routine. Are you using a lot of non-natural care products? Are you storing your food in plastic and putting it in there hot? Do you drink from a plastic water bottle? Do you use room fresheners or a lot of perfume? Just kind of think about, where am I exposing myself to chemicals, and can I reduce that or change that in any way? And then you can also increase anti-inflammatory things. So it's not just about not doing things. The more important thing is often doing things. So anti-inflammatory foods include things like ginger, turmeric, vitamin D, L-glutamine, NAC, zinc, and magnesium. So these are particular nutrients, and we'll talk more about those next week. Oily fish, again, chia seeds, linseeds, extra virgin olive oil, a rainbow of fresh fruits and vegetables, stress management, and good sleep. So again, these are things that you might already be starting to do. And by doing them, you're creating this double whammy effect of supporting yourself in more ways than just one. And again, if you think stress and good sleep are issues, then I would suggest watching the stress video that's on your Practice Better account. And then finally, time outdoors. So this is a really simple one. You can just make sure that every single day you get outside, and there's a lot of research now to show that this reduces inflammation, and it actually reduces our physical markers of inflammation, so it's really beneficial to do. Common intolerances. So certain people with histamine intolerance will have some food intolerances, and the more likely ones are gluten, dairy, fructose, and FODMAPs. FODMAPs are certain types of fiber, but these should only be excluded as a last resort, so that's not where we start. But gluten, dairy, and fructose are things you can think about from the beginning. So you can, if you think there are food intolerances, have a really strict 2-week period of low histamine and eliminate dairy and gluten during that time, and then reintroduce them one at a time to monitor how your symptoms change. If you've ordered a comprehensive stool test, you can also add a marker called zonulin, which also provides an indication of gluten sensitivity. And then finally, you can speak to your GP about a lactose and fructose breath test. If you've followed a low histamine diet for 4 to 8 weeks, you've excluded dairy and gluten, you've checked about fructose and lactose, and you haven't really seen enough improvements, then you could work one-to-one with somebody to implement a low FODMAP diet. But this is quite complicated, so I wouldn't recommend doing it at the beginning or alone. Now, the testing you can order via me. So on the Gut Health handout, you'll see more information about each of the tests and how to order them. And you just write to me on Practice Better to let me know, and then you can book the test through me and you'll get a practitioner discount, which is worthwhile, I think. So your tasks, read about the testing and write to me if you'd like to order a test. Have a look at the gut health handout and highlight the changes you want to make. So you'll notice there's tick boxes and you can just tick off those things you'll be trying to do over the next few weeks. And speak to your GP about intolerance testing. I can write a letter to support that. And as always, you'll find everything under the Forms and Worksheets tab or under the downloads list at the main module page. Here are all the references, and these slides will be uploaded as a PDF as well, so you can also have a look at those if you want to. I wish you joy and health, and I hope you found this video useful.